I'll have to keep, will that be okay? Because I will have to keep going that way to do the slide, but that's okay. I'll keep my volume level up as much as I can.
Welcome everybody along. Thank you for coming. And it's so close to Christmas. This is the last seminar of this year, of this calendar year for the Centre for Children's Rights. So first of all, I'd like to welcome you to a Centre for Children's Rights event. My name is Leslie Emerson. I'm the Deputy Director, and Laura is the Director of the Centre. And we're delighted to have Vicki with us today, who not only has agreed to do the seminar, but we filmed doing it, which is a brave thing indeed. So we really appreciate that, because what we're trying to do is to collate, whenever we have people giving seminars or over for talks, we're trying our best to collate as much of that on video as we can, so that we can host that information on the website. So do make sure that you visit our website on a regular basis, so that you can see what's new on it, but also a lot of the up and coming events that we'll be having over the next lot of years. If you've registered with Jan for this, it will mean that your email will automatically be added to our mailing list about events. If you didn't sort of email that way, or if you're not sure if your email address is collated, let us know, okay, and we'll maybe pass around a piece of paper or something. So if you put your email down, we'll be able to add you to the list of upcoming events. But as I said, delighted to have Vicki to come and speak to us. Vicki's going to talk and then is happy to take some questions at the end.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, thank you for inviting me. It's a real honour and privilege to come over and speak to you today. I've got obviously some slides here. Is there a way of putting that down a little bit so people can see? If people want the PowerPoint slide afterwards, I can...
too dark? Is that okay?
That's fine, thank you. I can obviously pass them to Leslie, and she can, if anybody wants them, you can have them. Yeah, that's not a problem at all. So thanks very much. I'm going to start by giving you what the essence of my argument is, and I think you probably got that anyway from the overview of the session. This work started probably about 5 or 6 years ago, when I was asked to participate in an ESRC seminar series around the issue of the ways in which psychoeducational programs were starting to become prominent in schools. The use of or the development of psychoeducational manuals in schools and programs within schools. And I was invited to come, and we had there were a number of seminars that we had where we were sort of different people contributing to the debate around that, whether or not this was something that was a good thing or not. And I went along with some significant reservations about that, and that's where this work is located. It sort of started, and the two publications that I've included, I think again on the overview you've got reference to them, derive from that initial analysis. And what I'm going to do today is, one of the things that I'd said, I think early on, was about the neglect of the ways in which children's for me, children's mental health and emotional well-being was located in the relational. There had been a fundamental problem in conceptualizing children's mental health and well-being within positivistic frameworks, within medical model frameworks, and that was, as I say, was sort of seriously problematic and was the wrong direction for policy and practice. Part of the reason for that was my previous existence before I was an academic. I worked as a child guidance social worker, working with children and young people in mental distress for some time. So I actually brought with me quite a lot of experience of working in the field, so it wasn't just about talking about this thing in an abstract sense. I'd been trained very much in the mainstream. I was trained by psychiatrists at the University of Manchester as a psychiatric social worker, and when I went to work with children and young people in the real world, I felt as though I very quickly learned that the models and frameworks that I'd been given with which to work with those children, young people, did not fit the reality of their lives. That these models were just, you know, they just didn't fit, and that the where the distress was located was much more about other factors. Factors to do with poverty, disadvantage, to do with a whole series of ways in which children and young people and their relationships with adults were seriously problematic, and that they themselves had been pathologized in many respects and were being subjected to diagnostic manipulation and therapeutic manipulation that was inappropriate. And as a practitioner, I felt compromised in that. I felt that there was a sense in which we needed to think differently about how we engage with children, young people in distress. And that is, again, I want to make sure that I don't want anyone to think that I am suggesting there's no such thing as emotional distress and mental distress with children and young people. What I'm saying is a medical model, or some of these models that we have for understanding that distress and responding to that distress, don't fit. And maybe we should actually be looking at some other models. So that's what that's about. The significance from this dimension that I'm going to focus on today is this idea about the significance of children, young people's agency and the relational in their narratives of their subjective well-being. Okay. So in setting the scene for this, and again, I'll try to go through this sort of as a backcloth. It's that idea that we've had this incredible attention to children, young people's mental health or emotional well-being in recent years, and this widespread concern about their well-being. So we have a lot of epidemiological studies that start to talk about rates of diagnosable disorder amongst children and young people and how this has been escalating. So the World Health Organization in 2005 estimated 2 million children and young people in the EU region of World Health Organization had some diagnosable disorder, so they say. We had other studies from the UK, Canadian studies, American studies, studies in Australia as well, giving statistics of a range of anything from 10% of the population through to 25% of the population of children and young people in those countries experiencing some form of mental disorder. We had lots of attention, particularly in the UK, around the notion of toxic childhood, what's happening in with children and childhood. The UNICEF, grounded in the idea of the UNICEF reports on well-being, showing us as very low in the league tables of well-being. And we had the Children's Society Good Childhood as well, and lots of media attention to this idea that there's somehow a deterioration in the mental health of children and young people. And then alongside that, we have the growth of influence of positive psychology again, a resurgence in neuroscience and in very positivistic frameworks and models, what I call a Lego approach to children and young people's mental health. The way in which these particular models of mental health claim that it's clearly possible to identify constituents of well-being, and in a systematic way. We can identify them, we can measure them, we can develop them, and we can manipulate them. And these, of course, being these nice, neat sort of ways of conceptualizing children's mental health, which I suggest are problematic, and I'll come on to say why in a second. And very often these are discourses that conflate all kinds of concepts. I've already myself used mental health, well-being. Another one was happiness. We had that whole attention to happiness as well, about the obsession with happiness too. And there's a sloppy conflation of concepts amongst these sorts of narratives as well. The bottom line, I think, in terms of policy and practice, was the ways in which these agendas started to be, whether they were professional, in professional discourses, academic discourses, or in popular discourse in media, were picked up and actually used by governments on globally, in many respects, identifying schools as natural environments for mental health promotion. Yeah? So this idea that we can somehow manipulate, we can identify what constitutes good mental health, well-being, and we can actually start to tweak and manipulate that in children and young people, starts to be picked up and developed in terms of these psychoeducational programs and training manuals. Okay. So things like in that, that you will be familiar, you may be familiar with, things like SEAL, yeah, SEAL, social emotional aspects of learning, CEL, various ones in different countries, Teen Screen in the States, Mind Matters in Australia, Safe Schools, Healthy Lives, you know, the Healthy Schools initiatives, various things like this, all you know, sort of policy orientations that build on particular programs, and particular programs, discrete programs, started to be developed from those. Okay, so clearly what, in terms of a kind of theorising what's going on, my concern was the way in which, as is, I've argued previously, this heavy emphasis on side discourse is what's underpinning the conceptualisation of children and young people's mental health here. It's side knowledge, and its role, I would argue, in producing governable subjects that is of concern to me. And the way in which, through the conceptualisation of children and young people's mental health, through side discourse, the way children are positioned, therefore, as educational objects of knowledge and practice. And the way in which the self-conduct of children and young people can be fashioned in desired directions. That's you know, why I've included the quote from Rose here, I think, illustrates that in terms of where the critique is coming from. That psychotherapeutics within the genealogy of political technologies of individuality, the shifting forms in which political power has come to bear on subjects and has sought to understand and govern them. The ways in which our authorities in pursuing social objectives have found it necessary and desirable to educate us in the technique for governing ourselves. So my argument is that, in a sense, what we're talking about is children and young people's individual biographies being shaped by these programs within a particular time and space, and in particular in relation to particular social forces. I can anticipate people would straight away say, well, that sounds very, again, very sort of structured, sort of deterministic. But what of agency in that? Well, essentially what I've argued is that it's precisely through an illusion of rights, interestingly enough, the child's right to good mental health, that these programs appear on the surface to be discourses of potentially liberation or empowerment. That a lot of the writing has been directed towards this idea that somehow we are attending to children's rights by introducing these programs, the right to good mental health. And implied in there is a benevolence, that this is actually very, very well-meaning, yeah, perhaps, but that is disguising the potency of essentially a discourse of power in there. The way in which we have, if you like, our own quest to self-actualize is precisely what's presented to us in a way in which we then become part of a script. I think, again, Nick Rose, another quote aside from this one, Nick Rose talks about us having stories of the self that our culture makes available to us. So in a sense, the way in which this works is precisely through the idea of agency, that subtle use of power, and the way in which children and young people's selves are being shaped in these particular ways. And then, when we look at the classroom, I think this quote from Zemblis is really, really important, because this is how we can see that discourses on emotion are always intimately related to issues of social power. And forgive me for reading it out, but I think it's a really important quote. Emotions in the classroom, for example, are not only a private matter, but also a political space in which students and teachers interact with implications in larger political and cultural struggles. The politics of emotion challenges the cultural and historical emotion norms with respect to what emotions are, how they're expressed, who gets to express them, and under what circumstances. It's in this sense that there's always something political in which teachers and students are caught up as they relate emotionally to one another in classrooms. Okay. So, in that sense, it's important too to recognise this sense of if you like, of power operating, yes, at a kind of macro level, structural level, but also as well as the micro. So it's not just about having a sort of unitary model of how power is operating here. It's about understanding the determining contexts of children and young people's lives, as well as their scope for agency and the struggles they have in terms of individual and intimate relationships too. And I think the quote from Sami Tamimi there is very, very important in that. The way in which he says that a nation's politics becomes the child's everyday psychology. The ways in which a lot of these discourses around emotional health and well-being are actually also go hand in hand within particular narratives, using phrases around active citizenship, around responsibilization, and are actually twinned with, especially in some of the EU documents that I've read, the way in which the discourse of employability for the future, the social investment state and the investment in mental health for the future actually points us in the direction of what the real concern is for government in relation to this. And so what I'm arguing for is that attention that we need to give to locating the critique within the structural reality of experiences of exclusion and marginality for a lot of children and young people. Okay, so I'm whizzing through this. I appreciate that. So essentially, what I've argued is that the psychotherapeutic education movement, if you like, we can perceive it as a response to a different crisis. The way in which these notions of well-being and resilience as well, the idea of fostering resilience, are actually used to legitimate the intensification of surveillance practices in relation to children and young people, and the way in which the vehicle of and the language of social justice and social inclusion is actually being used as a vehicle in relation to justifications of those practices, those intensified practices. And this idea of the child project, the way in which the child then is, the state and its agents bear down upon children, using this language, this discourse of sort of psychotherapeutic discourse of well-being, is all about that idea of making the self, yeah, this self-active, this idea, this invitation to make the self that's given to children. Some of the language within the SEAL documentation gives that away, this idea of making the self, of shaping the self. But of course, always, the self that the child is being invited to make him or herself into is the image of the adult. It's the image that the adult wants the child to be. In that. And yes, so this idea, as far as I'm concerned anyway, and I think I have some supporters in my argument, that this is actually about then, and it's about undermining any strong sense of of children, young people's subjectivities, about their subjective experiences, about potential alternative ways of understanding what's going on, and their lived experience in that sense. And so that's why in one of my papers was called Liberating the Mind or Governing the Soul. Are these programs and these interventions really about liberation, empowerment of children and young people, or actually are they an exercise in the governance of souls? And in that, I argued that this idea of individualization, on the one hand, because of that attention to the individual, sort of appears to open up this possibility for children's agency. But it's always, and yes, we have this kind of attention to children's voices in that. We've got to listen to children's voices. But essentially, there's a dominance of adult-centered studies. And they are at odds with the studies that are focused in terms of a rights-informed agenda and participatory methodological approaches. The contrast in those studies is remarkable. When we actually start to look at those, which we're going to do now, what children and young people say, what's important to them in terms of their positive mental health and well-being, and who they actually trust with their emotional lives, we get a very different message. And my argument is that those messages have been, if you like, taken a backstage. They have not been the most prominent ones, again, because I think, again, of the power of particular academic discourse and the authority of certain psi discourses in being able to advance a preferred understanding of well-being. Okay, so that's that. So there are three sort of areas that I wanted to concentrate on, having established that that kind of theoretical context. And I basically, what I've done here now is sort of a kind of meta-analysis. I've brought various pieces of work together under particular themes. And the first one is, when we think about conceptualizing well-being, it's about that, first and foremost, respecting children's competence in conceptualizing their own well-being. Yeah? Because most, as I've said, most of the prominent studies are very much about adult experts arguing what constitutes good mental health and emotional well-being in children and young people, and much fewer in relation to narratives from children and young people themselves. And so I think a really important piece that was written was by Ben Arya in 2005, which was this idea, where are the children? And that was that fundamental question about when it actually comes to all of this attention to measuring and monitoring emotional well-being in children and young people through these big epidemiological studies, for example. He argues, where are the children in that? Where are they? And that fundamental question has been taken up, I think, by a number of people. And we have started to see some very, very interesting work and interesting participatory methodologies in demonstrating children's competence in relation to conceptualizing well-being, and the way in which their conceptualizations are at odds with those of the adult experts. Okay, so it's McGowan, yeah, McGowan and Sixsmith's work in Ireland, I think, was a really excellent pioneering piece of work that was around facilitating children and young people's participation in developing the national wellbeing indicators in Ireland. And I think that was probably one of the first pieces of work that was actually really demonstrating how you can involve children and young people effectively and be, really have a methodology where you can find out exactly what it is that children and young people themselves feel about their emotional well-being. And they used this phased approach where they were describing at first, then analysing, and finally defining well-being through photographs, using photographs, getting that one set of children being involved in the photographs, other children involved in data analysis and interpretation. And that was really, really, as I say, sort of quite pioneering. And in terms of the way in which that work has since been developed, that has been incredibly important, I think, in feeding in to that idea of genuinely children's participation in being able to conceptualise well-being, and that being fed into policy and practice. Also in similar vein, in Australia, Jenna Gillette-Swan, in a piece that I know is going to be forthcoming in the summer next year, because I'm involved with her. She's an academic in Australia, and basically she's done again a really, really important piece of work, looking at the 8 to 12-year-olds again, and in terms of their capacity to conceptualise well-being there. And yes, again, it's this idea of her managing to identify those different levels, the complexity and the multifaceted nature of well-being is what she's actually really drawn out in her work. So it isn't, it's the nuances in terms of conceptualization of emotional well-being that she's drawn out, and the ways in which the children and young people are actually able to do that. That, again, challenge any idea in a kind of very narrow sense that children aren't really able to engage with that. And this idea of these different levels, again, describing, analysing and defining well-being. The interesting thing with her work, though, is that, which is I'm going to move into now, which is this idea about it all being about relationships, is while the really important theme in the focus groups and interviews that she did with the children in these sort of different phases, in the description level and the analytical level, and analysing their descriptions, the children and young people all, again, it was family and friends were sort of up here in terms of what was most important, family and friends. It was relationship again. But the interesting dynamic, and I want to have another conversation with her about this, when it came to the definition, they were then asked to produce a definition of well-being. They went, those dimensions went. Yeah. So they were focusing on family and friends there, but when it came to the actual definition, they seemed to conform more with the adult conceptualizations of mental health when it came to a definition. And she's speculating. I mean, I've had a conversation with her in September at conference, and I think she's speculating that in that there's a sense in which they have internalized a great deal of those messages around the definitions, and so they kind of tend to repeat then what is being, because a lot of these children and young people are also in sessions where they talk about their emotions again, they start to trot out the definitions in there, but when they have the opportunity to unpack it, they put it more in their own terms. So it's sort of quite interesting observation, I think, there. So the competence for her in that one, first of all, was about competence. So it's the idea, first and foremost, yes, we should accept that children and young people are competent to be able to conceptualise their own emotional well-being, and they don't need adults to tell them what their well-being is about. But in terms of the actual findings, in many research studies, it's this idea, when we have participatory research with children and young people, it is that idea of relationship. Relationship with family and friends dominate their conceptualizations of their well-being. And that is at odds with the kinds of messages and the kinds of structured programs that we have that are very individualized. You're very much about individuals, introspection, looking at yourself, identifying things within yourself that are problematic, that need attention and correcting. This is about relationship. That positive mental health is about relationship. Okay. So going to the UNICEF, again, what do children and young people say is important for their well-being? Again, I'm just making the case here. I've brought together a number of different pieces of work that essentially point in the same direction. The UNICEF, one part of the UNICEF well-being research that was done in Spain, Sweden and the UK, again, what would a good or bad day be like? One of the basic questions. And the findings, again, demonstrating that it is relationship, it's the quality of relationships that are central to children's subjective well-being. Good day being equated with time with those that they love, family, friends and pets. That goes back to McGowan's work as well. That they highlighted that. And across all three nations, it was people that made children happy, if we want to start talking about the happiness dimension. Friendship and companionship being essential to children's sense of happiness and stability. And equally, bad days were all linked in the same context. So it was about things going wrong in relationship. So when, in terms of what makes me sad, what makes for poorer mental health or less emotional well-being, it was the converse. It was about family arguments, bereavement, missing extended family, bullying. So when things go wrong in relationship, in essence, not within the individual. And again, these findings correlating with other large-scale studies like the Good Childhood Inquiry and also Alexander's the Cambridge Primary Review picked up on the same kinds of themes in there too. Again, further research from Australia, extensive qualitative research with children in Australia, England and Sweden by Jonathan Sargent. Again, with that tweens, he refers to them as tweens age group, their perspectives on worry and happiness. And again, overwhelming dominant theme being the importance of family, friends, relationships. So in his work, over 60% of all the overall responses were in that field. What do you need to make you happy? My friends and family, my pets. I need to have family and friends with lots of love and chocolate. People that make you laugh and feel safe like my friends and family. And what makes you worry, again, it's that converse. If something happened to one of my family members, someone close to me dying, or when my family fight. Again, the narratives and children reinforcing that idea of it being relationship. So they're not the only studies that reveal that. There are others, and the message in all of it, and with quite different methodologies in some cases, all arriving at the same sort of findings. This sort of next couple of slides are about the next stage with that for me, which was about these programs themselves and how if we have a different orientation in our research and with children and young people, the kinds of different messages that we're going to get and understandings. And for me, this is about what I call resisting therapy. And it's about other colleagues of mine in Linköping University in Sweden that I've been working with recently. And they've been doing some work around researching a particular implementation of a program in Sweden that's called DISA, shorthand to depression in Swedish adolescents. And again, it's a cognitive behavioural therapy-based prevention program that targets teenage girls. And there's a manual, a DISA manual. A teacher is trained as a DISA instructor, and the girls are expected to attend 10 structured sessions following the DISA manual, led by the teacher. Again, the manual focuses on these individual predefined problems and the idea of negative thoughts as a precursor to reorientating the girls' psychologies towards positive thinking. Again, very much rooted in Seligman's sort of work and orientation. And I think that's interesting. Some of the observations that I make about DISA myself, first of all, is it's very, very much participant as passive. passive recipients of the intervention. So again, DISA is being done to the girls. Interestingly, it requires the girls to identify with already having problems that the programme is supposed to prevent. So that is quite problematic. It seems a bit tautological to me that it's actually inviting the girls to already identify themselves as having some kind of individual problem. And then they're invited to search for the cause of that problem within themselves. So they're invited to focus on individual negative thoughts, this within themselves. And then DISA, through the DISA programme, supposedly they're being taught to reorientate their thinking more positively. Well, Annette Wickstrom did some brilliant work with a group of girls who were going through the DISA programme. And what was really wonderful about this particular piece of research, it was observational research, and there's some follow-up research as well in terms of some focus group work with the girls. But what Wickstrom observed was how these 13-year-old girls actually transformed the DISA course. Yeah, they resisted. So it's a wonderful article. I've put it on the references there. It's fascinating to see how the teacher is desperate to keep the girls on task in following the manual and how the manual is supposed to go. This is how it's supposed to go. But the girls are not having any of it at all. And essentially, they resist this effort of the teacher to get them to focus on. They question all the time. Why have we? What's this thing about negative emotions? I don't have any. So instead of this focusing on their inner states, what they did was they actually, if you like, they hijacked the sessions, and they used the sessions to talk with one another, to actually talk about what mattered to them in their friendships with one another and their relationships with one another, and to talk about other relationships too, and not just in a cosy, touchy-feely way, actually some points of tension as well in there. But so they kind of, as I say, took over that session, those sessions. And, as much as the teacher was getting increasingly frustrated, the really wonderful thing here is the teacher did actually then throw her hands up and actually enabled the young girls to actually have the space. She gave the space over to them and enabled them, if you like, to act. And so that was, if you like, in one sense then we see how a potentially problematic conceptualized program around dealing with mental health in girls was actually transformed then to focus on those relational issues, transformed by the girls. So their own agency, they were allowed, if you like, to do that. It relied upon that teacher being willing to do that, though. That's the issue. That teacher was flexible enough for that to happen. And whether or not that would, sort of routinely be the case is another matter. And I think, again, another way in which that I've sort of tried to conceptualize this idea of the relational is in terms of resistance practices. So we've seen there in that resisting therapy, that in terms of that DISA program. Again, if we look at some other research, here, Bottrell's work in Australia again, this, for me, is about realizing how resistance practices in themselves then are facilitators of well-being. Yeah? So it's in resisting that children and young people actually gain resilience in terms of their emotional well-being. And this work was based in research, some longitudinal research with young people in terms of inner city public housing in Sydney. Again, this age group is sort of teens into young adulthood. And again, it was work sort of methodology in terms of focus group and interviews with those young people, focusing on experiences of school, of truancy, and illicit, inverted commas, activities in terms of the local youth network. Again, the strongest message that came through was the importance of the networks of friends, family, and community being vital to well-being and resilience in these young people. And I think what's important in this research is that idea of even when these are depicted negatively by social and educational authorities. So what Bottrell was arguing was that in many instances, and I know that from my own practice, the kinds of behaviours from the children and young people would be being framed by social and educational authorities as deviant, as pathological, psychopathological in some way, rather than them being seen in that kind of frame, requiring the intervention of professionals in order to, she says, inculcate responsibilisation. These are actually precisely the mechanisms by which those young people gained resilience. It was in resisting that they gained resilience. Now I know, I mean, I had a conversation with an Australian colleague about this sort of recently, though. She works a lot with substance misuse projects, and she was saying, you know, this is always this dilemma about the extent to which that kind of you know, the kind of cultures, if you like, or subcultures within the young people that she works with are involved in. She says precisely that on the one hand, yes, of course, it's that tension, that risk that I do, again, to what extent as a practitioner can we balance that idea of riskiness, the idea of engaging in risky activity, and how we, you know, our protectionist impulse to want to protect and intervene in relation to risky behaviour, but on the other hand, the recognition of the importance of belonging within networks that are seen as potentially problematic in there as well. So there's a real, you know, there is a real dynamic going on there. And this is what, in a sense, Bottrell was talking about, that the ways in which these sort of psychopathological behaviours, on the one hand, are actually counteracted by framing them as resilience, resistance practices that actually facilitate well-being, emotional well-being. Right. And similarly, Unger's work in Canada with troubled teens, same kind of argument, that it's that idea that a child or young person can forge a resilient identity by challenging labels of disorder. And so they gain, if you like, well-being, belonging and power in doing so. And this is this idea of resilience being, again, rooted in the relational, the outcome of negotiations between individuals, others and their environments. And that those relationships, yes, are chaotic, complex, relative and contextual. And very often they are nurturing resilience in ways that are often invisible to professionals. And that basically is what undermines, I believe, the kinds of frameworks that try to look for these nice, neat sort of causal explanations and solutions, the kind of programs that look nice and neat in terms of identifying what makes for positive emotional well-being, are confounded, I think, by research studies like this, which are showing the complexity of what goes on in ways that are just too difficult, I think, at times for professionals to capture in the way that they would want to, in order to come up with solutions. Okay, so towards to start to bring this together, yeah. So basically, what I'm suggesting is that discursive framing of children's well-being is first and foremost its functioning to organise children's thoughts and experiences, and impose a language, more importantly, about emotional material that's not of the child's own choosing. So that's that first important idea of the importance of beginning, in terms of the beginning point should be the conceptualization of well-being from children and young people themselves. That at the moment, the kind of dominant discourse is actually imposing a language that's not of the child's own choosing. Secondly, that it's problem-focused. It's always negative in terms of problem-focused, where problems are seen as individual deficits, independent of relational contexts, and that's undermining the strong sense of the child's subjective experience, the alternative truths or realities. And again, that it's at odds with the messages from participatory research with children and young people in terms of what they're saying makes for their mental health and well-being. And so when we do investigate that notion of well-being from the perspectives of children and young people, we do find that it's overwhelmingly defined and experienced in relational rather than individual terms, that resistance practices play that really important role in fostering emotional resilience and enhancing children and young people's subjective well-being. And because of all of that, our research, our policies and our practices in terms of children and young people's well-being need to be in tune with their perspectives and priorities. Okay, so thank you. Any questions?
Thank you very much, Vicki. Now I know that Vicki's happy to take questions or comments.